Here's something that doesn't make sense. The United States government owes $36 trillion. That's more debt than every other country on Earth combined. Your share? About $108,000 per person. And yet, somehow, America isn't bankrupt.
In fact, countries are literally fighting each other to lend us more money. Wall Street's thriving. The dollar's still king. How is this even possible? The answer is going to blow your mind, and it'll completely change how you think about money, power, and who really runs the world.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Capital and Power. In my last video, I asked who the debt is owed to, and thousands of you had the same follow-up question. Okay, but if we owe this much, why hasn't the whole system collapsed?
Great question. Because on the surface, it makes zero sense. If you or I owed that much relative to our income, we'd be homeless. If a business owed that much, it'd be liquidated. But countries, especially America, play by completely different rules. By the end of this video, you'll understand the 4 reasons the U.S. can sustain astronomical debt, why this gives America insane power over the global economy, and most importantly, the hidden warning signs that could signal when this whole thing finally breaks. Whether you're worried about inflation, confused about national debt, or just trying to understand how the game is rigged, this is essential viewing.
And real quick before we dive in, if you want more content that breaks down the financial system without the BS, hit that subscribe button. We're building a community that actually understands how money and power work in America. All right, let's get into it.
So let's start with the basics. Because most people hear $36 trillion in debt and immediately think, that's bad, right? Well, yes and no. Here's the thing. Countries don't operate like households. You can't compare your personal finances to a nation's finances. Completely different game, completely different rules.
When you go into debt, you're borrowing from someone stronger than you, a bank, a lender, someone with more resources. You're in the weaker position. You have to pay them back or face consequences, bad credit, lawsuits, bankruptcy. But when America goes into debt, we're not in the weak position. We're in the strong position, and that changes everything. Think about it like this. If you owe the bank $10,000, that's your problem. But if you owe the bank $10 million, that's the bank's problem. They need you to survive now, because if you go down, they go down with you. Scale that up to $36 trillion, and suddenly you realize America's creditors don't want us to fail. They can't afford for us to fail. Our debt is their investment. Our collapse would be their collapse. That's the first piece of the puzzle, but there's way more going on here. Let's break down the 4 specific reasons America can keep this going. Here's the biggest advantage America has, and most people don't even realize it exists. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency. What does that mean in plain English? It means that when countries trade with each other, when Japan buys oil from Saudi Arabia, when Germany buys electronics from China, they don't trade in yen or yuan or euros. They trade in US dollars. This creates something insane. The entire world needs dollars to function. Even if they hate us, even if they compete with us, they have no choice but to hold massive amounts of US currency. Here's why this matters for debt. When America borrows money, we borrow in our own currency. Let me repeat that because it's crucial. We borrow in dollars, and we can print dollars. Compare that to countries like Argentina, Turkey, or Venezuela. When they borrow, they often have to borrow in dollars or euros, currencies they can't print. So when their economy struggles, they're stuck. They can't print their way out. They default. Game over. But America, we borrow in dollars, and in a worst-case scenario, we can literally print more dollars to pay our debts. Now, that would cause inflation. We'll talk about that. But it means we can't technically default the way other countries can. This is what economists call exorbitant privilege.
We get to borrow at lower interest rates than anyone else. We get to run bigger deficits than anyone else. And we get away with it because the whole world needs our currency.
Real example. During COVID, the Federal Reserve printed $5 trillion. Did the dollar collapse? No. Why? Because every other country was also scrambling for dollars. Global demand absorbed the supply. That's the privilege of being the reserve currency.
But here's the catch, and this is important. This privilege only lasts as long as the world trusts the dollar. The moment that trust cracks, the moment countries start trading in yuan or euros or some new currency, America's advantage disappears. And when that happens, the debt suddenly becomes a massive problem. So the first reason we haven't collapsed, we control the money everyone needs. As long as that's true, we hold all the cards.
Here's something that's going to surprise you. The majority of U.S. debt isn't owed to China or foreign countries. It's owed to us, to Americans. Let me break this down because it's wild. About 70% of U.S. government debt is held domestically. Who holds it?
Social Security Trust Fund. When you pay Social Security taxes, that money doesn't sit in a vault. The government borrows it and gives Social Security IOUs, bonds. Social Security owns about $2.7 trillion in U.S. debt.
The Federal Reserve, America's central bank, owns about $5 trillion in U.S. government bonds. Essentially, the government owes money to itself.
Pension funds, your retirement accounts, state pensions, private pensions, they're loaded with U.S. Treasury bonds because they're considered safe.
Insurance companies, they need stable, long-term investments. They buy Treasury bonds.
Individual Americans, through savings bonds, retirement accounts, mutual funds, millions of Americans own U.S. debt without even realizing it.
So here's the weird reality. When politicians freak out about the national debt, they're freaking out about money we owe to ourselves. It's not like some foreign power can show up and demand payment tomorrow. Here's the dirty secret that's kept the whole system running. For the past 15 years, interest rates have been historically low, like really low. After the 2008 crisis, the Federal Reserve dropped interest rates to nearly zero, and they stayed there for over a decade. This was intentional. They wanted to stimulate the economy, encourage borrowing, get money flowing.
But here's the side effect. It made U.S. debt incredibly cheap to service. Even though we owed trillions, the interest payments were manageable because the rates were so low. To put numbers on it, in 2020, the U.S. spent about $345 billion on interest payments for the debt. That sounds like a lot, but it was only about 1.6% of GDP. Totally manageable.
But then inflation hit, and the Fed had to raise interest rates to fight it. Rates went from near zero to over 5% in just 2 years. And here's where it gets scary. As those old low-interest bonds mature, they get replaced with new high-interest bonds. The interest payments are exploding.
By 2024, the U.S. is spending over $1 trillion per year just on interest payments. That's more than we spend on the entire military, more than Medicare. It's becoming one of the biggest line items in the federal budget. And here's the kicker. That money doesn't build roads, doesn't fund schools, doesn't pay for healthcare. It's just gone, paid to bondholders as interest. This is the warning sign. This is the crack in the foundation. As interest rates stay high, the debt becomes more and more expensive to maintain. At some point, the interest payments could become so large that they crowd out everything else.
Economists call this a debt spiral. You borrow money to pay interest on old debt, which creates more debt, which creates more interest, and the cycle accelerates. So to answer the original question, why hasn't the U.S. collapsed yet despite $36 trillion in debt? Because we control the world's reserve currency. Because we mostly owe the debt to ourselves. Because the economy has kept growing. Because interest rates were low until recently. But that last one, that's changing, and fast.
So here's what you need to watch for. These are the signs that the system might actually be breaking. Sign number 1. Countries start abandoning the dollar. China and Russia are already trying. They're conducting trade in yuan, in their own currencies. If this trend accelerates, if OPEC stops pricing oil in dollars, if major economies start using alternatives, America's privilege disappears overnight. Sign number 2. Interest payments exceed defense spending. We're already there. When debt service becomes the biggest expense, it means we're losing control. Sign number 3. Inflation becomes uncontrollable. If the government has to print money to service debt, inflation could spiral. Your dollars lose value. Everything costs more. This is how currencies die. Sign number 4. Economic growth stalls. If GDP growth drops to 1% or less while debt keeps rising, the math stops working. We can't grow our way out anymore. None of these have fully happened yet, but we're seeing early warning signs of all of them. The U.S. hasn't collapsed because the system is designed to prevent it, but systems designed to never fail often fail catastrophically when they finally do break, because no one's prepared.
Here's the bottom line. The United States can sustain $36 trillion in debt because we have advantages no other country has. The reserve currency status, the ability to borrow from ourselves, a massive economy, and historically low interest rates. But advantages aren't guarantees. They're temporary privileges that can disappear if trust breaks, if growth stalls, or if the world finds an alternative.
The system hasn't collapsed yet, but yet is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. So what do you do with this information? Understand that the rules are different for nations than for individuals. Understand that debt isn't inherently catastrophic until it is, and understand that the warning signs are starting to flash. If this video gave you a new perspective on U.S. debt and why the system hasn't collapsed, hit that like button. And if you want more breakdowns of how money and power actually work in America, subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, here's my question for you. Do you think the U.S. debt is sustainable long-term, or are we heading for a crisis? Comment sustainable if you think we'll be fine, or crisis if you think collapse is coming. Let's see where this community stands. And if you missed the first video, if every country is in debt, who's the money owed to? Go watch it now. It sets up everything we discussed today. Thanks for watching, stay informed, stay critical, and I'll see you in the next deep dive. Peace.